But tonight we need to define quilting versus quilt. Quilting is a verb. Quilt is a noun. Okay. And a quilt, I looked it up on my phone before I started the camera. Quilt is defined as, where did it go now? On dictionary.com, 2 layers of fabric with a soft substance in between, stitched in pattern or tufted, I'm assuming tied, through all thicknesses. Okay, so a thesaurus, when I looked it up in thesaurus, thesaurus means exactly opposite, and it said blanket.
Oh.
Now, how do we all feel when somebody comes up and says, "Thank you for the blanket"? It kind of ruins it, doesn't it? You're like, oh, in the knitting world, be called whips, works in process. Okay,
I like that.
whip. It's a whip. So, show of hands. How many has a whip or a UFO? Okay. 2 hands. Okay. How many have one that's more than 5 years old? Kathy, you're so good. And how many have more than 10 projects total that are whips or UFOs? Okay, we don't know. I have a lot of UFOs, and this behind me was one of them. This was my oldest one. It was 2004. I started it. By no means fair quality. Halfway through this process of making all these flowers and leaves, I started over here. This side is almost completely cotton, where this was the last side I just completed Monday night. It's a lot more wool, because why? Wool is warm. You don't have to needle turn it. You don't have to sew it. It's not going to fray as much, okay? But that brings me to my next topic. I'm going to be kind of severe on some, including myself. The acronym SAP, synthetic, acrylic, and polyester. How many of us have those yucky things to deal with? Okay, Sharon has one. Okay. I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Charlene. The method they used to teach us this started out with monofilament. This is like thin fishing line. Okay, you go to wash your quilt, and they used it for applique, but I've seen some people quilt with this. What's going to happen when you put this in the washer and the dryer?
It'll break.
It'll melt. It'll melt. I'll pass this around. And it goes through the
Trashes your machine.
Oh, it trashes your machine, and it gets thinner. You can pull on it. It's just a nightmare. Who remembers doing this? I want to make sure everybody knows it was the 70s. This was my very first quilt. It was a 4-H. What a contrast of colors. I did use it for my babies when they were born. But, and it's hand quilted. It's just a piece of cheater's cloth, and I remember setting this up in my room for 4-H, and I quilted this. I quilted around the little Sunbonnet Sues and the Farmer Johns and whatever. But what's on the back? Tricot! Tricot! And the middle is polyester. But it was the era. It was the 70s. Okay? It was the era. Yes, that monofilament is nasty stuff. Okay, how far have we come between here and here?
Oh my.
Just in fabrics alone. Just in the quality of the fiber that we're working with. I'm a fiber snob. I'll be the first to admit it. I'm sorry. I'm just that way. I still use heirloom quality, graduations, weddings, 16th birthdays. I made my son a quilt when he got his Eagle Scout award. Just the best of materials. I mean, we all know this process. So I started analyzing this. That was in literally, all the baskets were done, but it was in about 4 pieces. 1, 2, 3, 4, and this wasn't even in existence yet. Started analyzing this thing. Okay, I got so much time and effort just into the baskets with all these triangles. I want to finish it. I don't want to make these baskets into orphan blocks or into pillows or whatever. What can I do to finish this quilt to make it go along a little bit faster? The stem, this one stem clear over here, it's real short, and that's how I did this stem and this stem here in the middle. There's only 3 parts that had applique on it, so went much faster. Okay, materials, tools, whatever you want to call it. The other thing I used, not all of them, but some of them, I used wool thread because I felt, okay, if I wanted to mimic kind of the natural fiber, and I had this on hand, I didn't go out and buy it special.
Now, excuse me.
Go ahead, ask away.
Did you put that thread, that spool on your machine?
I used it as my top thread. My bobbin was just a thin cotton metler, you know, something thinner than that.
And a blanket stitch.
In a blanket stitch. But keep, and I know Kathy was working on one the other day too. T-shirt quilts. Those have vinyl on the top. I made my son one. He played lacrosse in high school in a big, you know, Mountain View high school, and then I think he was number 32. You know, big, wide, thick numbers. They're great to piece, but for me as a long arm quilter, they're a nightmare to quilt.
Yeah.
I have to stay off all that vinyl. You've got sweatshirts that are super thick. You've got T-shirts that are thin. You've got jerseys that have holes in them. You had them all. You just have them all, but you got to kind of roll with the flow. And the kids love them. The kids are so in love with these T-shirt quilts right now. You got to make them. You know, you got to make them. Anyway, I was looking at this particular quilt. I wanted to finish it. I changed both the tools I used, mainly materials. When I found this, I kind of improvised. I thought, okay, I can finish and use that sometime. And the wool. The wool was a huge help because I could easily just cut that out. I didn't have to iron any adhesive on the back. I could just put it on my quilt. I did the blanket stitch around it, and all of them, for the most part, and I only wanted to put a pantograph on this and all over edge to edge pattern. I was not going to custom quilt this, even though I could have taken the time to do it. It's just got an all over pantograph on it. I could have stayed off of that, but then I would have tripled my quilting time too. That's why custom quilting costs so much more money, is you gotta take those kinds of things into consideration. So for this quilt, I changed the type of my materials. This quilt, though, is no longer my taste. We're talking 2004. How many of us have changed in the last 14 years? It's the colors are okay, but it's not my, it's more folk art to me, if that makes sense. I will still use it. No, Sharon doesn't get it after the retreat. And the last thing was, and I didn't have one up here in our tiny little community. I'm sure one of you probably could have, but because I was in such a rush, they're called bias bars. Has anybody heard of those? Mm-hmm. Kathy, you have? Yeah. Yes, Katie. Okay, I could have turned that stem, as far as I'm understanding, borrowed a bias bar, turned that stem, and ironed it as I went to keep that seam on the bottom part. And I just didn't, I was kind of in a rush. But so tools, change the method, change the materials. Think of that one, maybe your oldest UFO. What don't you like about it? If you flat out just don't like it, let's say it's an acrylic sweater from the 70s, unwind it, give it away, do something. But it's so therapeutic to get something done from 14 years ago. So, any questions? I heard
you covered a lot.
I heard Kathy talking about finishing this and that, and Diane, and all these unfinished projects that we all have, and even Kathy, when we were talking about going to retreats. It's so therapeutic to finish something at a retreat. To finish, oh, I got this done. I got it done, even if it's just the top. A lot of us are piecers at retreats. We don't do the whole thing. We just piece the top or work on our projects, purses, whatever. I think it was the second year I was here. I shared a table with Katie right over here, and my daughter came with me, and she was pregnant. And she is not a sewer. She's not a quilter. She's not a knitter. She makes wonderful cards. Very intricate, lacy, old-fashioned looking cards. But she has not the patience of anything. and she made this beautiful bag, ruffles out the wazoo, because she knew she was having a little girl, and it was pink and gray, I want to say. There was an error even in the pattern, and she figured that part out, and she inspired me that quilting retreat. So finish something, even if you go home from here and say, okay, I want to finish this, it's close. This, I'd have to say, was probably, if you count all the piecing in these baskets, is probably halfway done. It was just a matter of I couldn't piece the top all together, because if you see this leaf right here, it comes over onto this other piece. So I kind of had to do this one in pieces and parts, and I left off that flower. This one, same thing. See, this one comes over right here. There's a seam here. I put this down and just kind of pinned it back. Then once it was all together, I could put, I think there was a couple. This one down on the bottom here, and this one. Shifting that around on my sewing machine to get, and this flower, you can't really see it, but it's got petals like this all the way around. So I was moving that on my machine. Oh, it was kind of a nightmare, but I got through it because I said, I'm going to finish this. This is going to be my show and tell.
You didn't even have the blocks sewn together?
I had the baskets. I had the baskets sewn together, and this literally was in this much for one piece, because I had this part done. This with no applique, but it was pieced. And then this was pieced, but no applique. This didn't even exist quite yet. I mean, so I was what? Half, two. But I would say it's about halfway done, and I decided I was going to get this done for this retreat. So,
Well, I happen to love folk art, so it would go great in my house.
okay.
Just saying, just saying.
Well, nobody really knows, but this is my exchange for tomorrow. Just kidding.
More thread on your long arm.
I probably could, but again, I would have to have a huge needle, and probably like in the long arm world, it'd be a 5. That's the biggest you could do. Also, I'd have to really loosen up my tension gauges and everything. Set my stitch length on about an 1/8, the biggest one, the biggest length. That's a good question. I should try messing around with that sometime. But anyway, anything else? Oh.
Did you have a question?
No, you're good. Nothing else? Okay. Sew away. Have fun.
Great, thanks. That was fun.
It's going to be a ganache. Something that's going to be for breakfast.